Hi, I'm Marvin,
And I'm Lauren, and we've been married for about 9 years.
and here are some marital tips that helped us that may help you.
So, first and foremost, is keep God first on a personal level as well as a couple. So, make sure you maintain your relationship with God one on one so that you're hearing from God and can be led by God in your decisions.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the next thing that we do is we make time for love. That means no social media, no TV, phones, games, or any type of internet that keeps you from one another. You specifically make time for your spouse. That way you get into good conversations and talk about your life, talk about your future, talk about what makes you happy, talk about things that just anything that you could think about personally that can help you out.
And that's a time that you would agree upon. So it's not just like one person comes in and just says, hey, put down your phone. It's you agree that maybe after 8 p.m. there's no devices, no TV, so that you at least present opportunity for you to have good conversation with one another.
All right. Second one. Next one.
So another thing that we do is we serve one another without expectation or without keeping score. So if you're busy serving each other, then you will keep serving each other because you're going to be so excited that the other person did this, and that for you. And so you're going to want to do more for them. So if your focus is on serving one another, then that is beneficial because you also reap seeds from a spiritual perspective. So every time that you sow your service to your spouse, then you get to reap a harvest from that.
Right. The next one is we learn to trust the God in our spouse. A lot of times you grow up with this misconception that you have to submit to someone else or you have to do whatever the woman says or do whatever the husband says. But when you go back to the first one, which is keep God first in your life, the best thing you could do is trust that they hear from God, trust that they're leading you in a great direction that can help the family, help you out. And it's not to here to hurt you or harm you, but it's actually making sure that you trust the God in the person, and then of course make sure that person, what they're hearing from God, aligns with the Word of God.
And one thing I found in our relationship is that rather than getting into an argument, if I trust God, that Marvin hears from God, then God will speak to him sometimes and have him do something different than what he thought he was going to do. So I don't have to argue with him or debate. I just give it to God, and then God shows him, and then all of a sudden, if I said go left and he was planning to go right, he may go left. And I don't have to say, oh, told you so. I just say, okay, that's what God had for us. And if there's something where I think that maybe he missed the mark, that's where God's grace abounds. So that's part of trusting God. So when you're submitted to God, then you can trust him that all things will work out together for your good.
Yeah. Another one we like to do, which is my personal favorite, is hypothetical conversations. So you may be starting off your marriage. You may not have children. You may have children, whatever the case may be. But you think about things that haven't happened yet and the what ifs of the world. So a lot of times it's like, what if your child came home and said she was pregnant at 16 years old? What do you do? What if you had to move all of a sudden to a new city for work? What do you do? Like, how would you act? How do you respond? You make up a lot of conversations, or you see stuff on TV or you see stuff on social media that has happened to someone else, and then you ask your spouse about the same thing and ask them what they would actually do. Because a lot of times you don't want to be in the middle of the situation and then you got to make a quick decision and somebody doesn't like that decision, and then you get into an argument and then you just start to fuss and fight about, well, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that. And then but if you had that conversation, you kind of know the thought process of your spouse. That way you can actually figure out, this is the plan, this is our mindset, this is where we're going to go. So if a situation even similar comes to that, you kind of have an understanding of how your spouse thinks about that situation.
And they don't all have to be like detrimental type of situations. It could be something as simple as the lottery. Let's say we won the lottery.
Yeah.
Do you immediately go buy your mother a house? Well, are you going to buy my mom a house too? Like, just having conversations so that you understand how you each think and approach things, and doing it in an open way that's non-threatening. You don't want to just diminish the thought process of your spouse, but you just want to learn more about them. And they can be fun conversations. They can even be things like, well, if a guy checks me out at a store, how will my spouse react? How does he expect me to react? So that way you avoid tension. You already know the expectation of one another, and you don't want to, once again, it's not to you don't want to get in an argument over it. It's just to make sure that you understand how you each think about different situations.
All right. Go to the next one.
So the next one is maintaining transparency. And so that goes along with having these conversations. So being comfortable with having different opinions without taking offense with one another. Being comfortable letting your spouse know, I feel this kind of way about this situation, and then making sure that you don't attack your spouse for the way that they may feel or think about a certain situation. So you want to maintain that open transparency, that open communication, make space for that and room for that in your relationship.
Right. And transparency also means honesty. You want to be honest with your spouse. You know, a lot of times you hear the story of, how do I look good in this dress? And the husband's automatically supposed to say, oh, you look great. Well, if that's not really how you feel, or if you don't like the way she cooks or certain things like that, you need to be transparent, open, honest with your spouse and say, hey, you say it in love, but you say, hey, I don't like this dress on you, or I don't like when you cook this type of chicken, or whatever the case may be. And then that way you say it in love, and you have to be willing to receive it well, because you know your spouse loves you. At least you're supposed to know that. Mm-hmm. You know your spouse loves you. You know your spouse cares about you, and so you know they're not really trying to deliberately hurt your feelings.
Right.
And so a lot of times you can just be transparent with them, and that way you don't hurt anyone's feeling. But that at the same time, you can also get your desires across the table. That way you don't have to just live a life of walking on eggshells.
And note on the transparency aspect that it's a choice to be offended. So yes, you want to make sure that when you communicate things, you do them in a kind, respectful way. But you also want to receive it. So if he said, I don't like this meal that you made, and I spent 5 hours cooking that meal, well, hey, the upside is I don't have to cook it again. Because if he didn't like it, then I don't have to make it again, even though I may have spent all of that time thinking it was a really special meal. So make sure that you remain open-minded and allow your spouse to be transparent with you.
Absolutely. Another thing that we like to look at is discuss potential insecurity. It takes boldness to be open with your spouse about insecurities, about specific things, about how you were raised, how you look, everything like that, and explain it to your spouse that these are things that you're desiring to overcome, or you have recently overcome. That way, it won't be a button pusher for someone else. So you can explain insecurities with someone else and say, hey, this is what my insecurities was. I was afraid of approaching women, or I'm afraid of how I looked. So that way the other person can build that insecurity up in your spouse. So if you say, hey, I didn't always look the greatest in my mind in the past, and that your spouse could be like, hey, you're beautiful, hey, you're handsome, and that way your insecurities are not like exposed. They're more or less just driven away slowly by the actual communication and encouragement of your spouse.
And that's something that is important, period, is just affirming each other, being intentional to appreciate one another as well as to affirm one another. Yes, your spouse may be responsible for taking out the trash, but you can still say thank you for taking out the trash. You want to make sure that you show appreciation and don't take one another for granted. And then you want to do things like, my husband tells me I'm beautiful each day. And no, it doesn't have to be all this big, romantic, beautiful thing, that the way he presents that information, but he's doing it just to speak life over me. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, he does mean it, but he also says it just to make sure that that's something that I'm consistently hearing, that my spouse finds me beautiful. And that's important.
Absolutely. Next one.
So the next one is that we choose to do in our marriage is we don't argue. We have discussions, but it's a choice to be offended. And it's a choice to yell, and it's a choice to scream. It's a choice to want to shut each other out. For our personality types, we would probably both shut each other out. So we've decided that we just don't argue. We can have discussions, and we can present those discussions to God. And the thing is that when we go back to that concept of trusting God in your spouse, trusting the God in your spouse, God will position you so that you come into agreement. So having conversations is good, having that transparency, allowing for the open communication, but you don't have to argue. You can have a discussion without getting heated about the situation.
Absolutely. So a lot of times it's opportunity. This is something I believe God gave to me, is don't argue. It's just a waste of time. It's a waste of energy. It's a waste of just everything, because a lot of times you are just defending your point. You're not necessarily listening to someone else, you're just defending your point. So you want to be able to have that communication where you can discuss a certain thing and listen to your spouse. And so if you're too busy arguing, trying to defend your point, you're not necessarily listening.
Right.
And so you can have a disagreement. You know, I like the color blue, she likes color red. Interesting, we got the same kind of shirts on like that. But a lot of times, you know, if you like that specific color, it's like, hey, that's just, we can agree to disagree. It's okay. It is not the end of the world.
Yeah.
This is not a detrimental point where it's just going to hurt our family. It's not a point of, you know, I don't believe in God anymore kind of thing. And even if someone has that opinion, you can just hear that person, listen to them, and then just agree to disagree. And you don't have to have these long, heated, debated, just cursing each other out or shutting each other out type conversations.
Or screaming matches.
Yeah, just agree to disagree, and you can stay calm. That way you don't, you know, have stress and gray hair and all the other stuff based off of that actual point of view.
And on that note, it's also, I would recommend, there are certain discussions that you might want to make sure that you have privately and not in front of your children. Allow your children to be children, so they don't have to be brought into all of your heavy conversations. Absolutely.
So another thing that we like to actually do, also, once again, it's part of the keeping God first aspect. That's the whole kind of sum of this whole thing, is pray together weekly. It's always great to pray. You know, the Bible says where two or three are gathered together in my name, there God, Jesus will be in the midst. So agreement, the power of agreement is huge. So obviously the enemy, the devil, is always trying to break up God's institution called marriage. So praying together weekly, make sure that, you know, you pray for your spouse, you pray over your spouse, you pray with your spouse, you pray over your spouse's family and over your family. That way you are in the agreement. Any big decisions that needs to be made, you could talk about that in prayer and just, you know, pray to God that this specific thing works out for your favor, and, you know, you praise God that it all works out for your good. So that way you keep prayer covered in your marriage, and communication with God is always huge. He is always the head and the third person in this marriage. So praying with him and communication with him, it doesn't have to be this huge, long 20-minute prayer. It could be simple 5-minute, 3-minute prayer. That way you kind of just stay in agreement with each other, praying over your spouse. And heck, if you want to do it daily, you're more than welcome to do that. So, I mean, we just choose it weekly. So that's because we get time factor and, you know, just making sure we keep God first in the marriage.
Right. So y'all come to a consensus as to what that regularity will be with praying together, but it is important to come together and pray. And it is also important to pray over your spouse and pray for God's protection, that they don't fall into temptation. But you also want to make sure that your prayers are not complaints about what you think should be done, they should be doing better. It's about truly covering your spouse in prayer, realizing that we're human, and so we need God in every aspect of our lives.
Right, so next one.
So another one that we like is the love languages. You can actually do a search for love languages if you're not familiar with that. But finding out what it is that's really important to your spouse. So there are certain love languages that tend to be more important. So for example, for one person, quality time may be at the top of their list. But for someone else, it may be service. So they're so busy trying to serve their spouse in different ways, maybe doing their chores, and for their spouse that doesn't really mean as much. It's not that that's not important, but for that person it may be quality time. So rather than going around and doing your spouse's chores, they may rather you sit on a couch next to them, just spend time with them. So it's important to find out what's most important for your spouse.
Yep, learning love languages is pretty huge, and it can change over time.
Yes.
So you just want to be mindful of that. Things that you liked or, you know, loved 1 year could be totally different 5 years from now.
Right.
So you can just, you know, just learn to keep that fresh and keep that communication. Yeah, revisit it. Keep that communication open with your spouse, and, you know, that way you can learn the love language at that specific time so that your spouse can continuously meet that need.
And that's where you bring God back in. You ask God how to show you how to best love your spouse, because your spouse is ever changing and ever evolving, and no one knows your spouse better than God.
Yeah. Another thing that we like to do, Lauren mentioned this earlier, is to say please and thank you. It's just common courtesy. You do that all the time at work or in public. So you might as well do that to the most important person in this world besides God and maybe your child is your spouse. So you want to say that thank you for picking this up. Thank you for giving me some water. Thank you for actually doing your chores. Even though it didn't have to be done, you don't have to say thank you. It's just a common courtesy, and it goes a long way. And no one wants to be told what to do. No one wants to be commanded like a slave. But you want to actually just be kind and courteous. Was it not courteous? Courteous to one another. And so you want to actually make sure that goes as far as it can go.
So as opposed to me saying, Marvin, get me some water, I can say, Marvin, would you please get me some water? And you may say, oh, do I really need to do all of that? But it has a different feel, a different connotation, and it shows a level of appreciation for your spouse.
Right, and it keeps all the tension out of your actual relationship. So you don't have to actually, you trying to tell me what to do, you don't have to have an argument. That's another argument because you just never know what your spouse may be going through that day.
Right.
And so that one telling what to do is just going to be tipping over, and then he or she just blows up, and then you just are like, where did that come from? I just asked for some water. But if you said, please, thank you, and would you like anything? And that's something that you can just continue to keep that common courtesy going.
And on that note, be sure to extend grace to your spouse, because sometimes there are situations that can arise that may be more challenging. And so continuing to extend that grace, continuing to show the love of God and be kind, your spouse will see that. Like you continuing to be kind, your spouse sees that. Like when we first had our daughter, Marvin had a rough time adjusting to not getting as much sleep. But God gave me the strength, instead of like snapping back, because he got a little snippy with some things. Instead of being snippy back, God allowed me to continue to show him grace. And he realized it, and he was like, I appreciate that you continue to be kind. And now I'm going to modify my behavior to better adjust to the situation. And also be willing to apologize and receive an apology.
Absolutely. So a lot of these things, like I said, that's pretty much all the things that we actually go through. I'll just go over it one more time. The first thing you do, of course, is keep God first. The second thing you do is to make time for love. That's the no social media. You just specifically spend quality time, 30 minutes, an hour or more with your spouse.
I mean, even 10, 15. It's just important to spend time with one another. Just spend
time with one another without any distractions. Another one is serve one another without expectation or keeping score. That way you can just actually just serve them. Just do and do and do for them. Don't, well, I did this for them and they didn't do this for me. So
and go back to the scripture, Ephesians 6:8.
Ephesians 6:8. Whatsoever good any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord. So you doing good for your spouse is something that God notices, and you'll receive it from the Lord. And your spouse may be in a mood or for a week, a month, or whatever, and you just have to continue to just serve that person and know that is noticed, and that same reward will be received from the Lord. It may be from your coworker. You may get some type of blessing from that. You just never know. Another one is learn to trust God in your spouse. We talked about that. In hypothetical conversations, make up conversations that you can just think about what if,
scenario, situations, financial,
right,
relational,
whatever the case may be.
Even fun stuff like vacations, where they would want to go, make a list, like in what order do they want to do it? Are there certain things they would want to do as family trips or retirement trips or right now trips or different things?
Maintain transparency, be open, honest, be willing to just be open with your spouse. Discuss the potential insecurities. Don't argue, just don't do it. It's just not necessary.
But you can have discussions. It doesn't mean that you don't ever
discussions
talk
or
about
disagreements. Pray together weekly. Learn your love languages and say please and thank you.
Be courteous.
Considerate and courteous. That's pretty much all we have. Hope this helps. I know this will. If you continue to apply it and just remember to do it and be diligent in doing it, it'll actually bless your life tremendously. And God can give you more things that you can actually do that can help your personal relationship and marriage out.
The most important thing is to keep God first and be led by the Spirit of God so that you can love your spouse the way that He has you to.
Yep. Hope this helps. Well, we love you. Have a blessed day. Adios.